Good evening and welcome to another webinar hosted by the Thousand Oaks Photo Group. I'm Hutch Hutchison and tonight's subject is landscape photography. Ansel Adams once said that landscape photography is the supreme test of the photographer and often the supreme disappointment. That's been my experience, and I'll bet it has been for some of you also. It can so often seem so easy out in the field and so disappointing later in the confines of my computer screen and office. So, tonight I'm going to share some compositional elements, guidelines, and tips that I try to incorporate in my landscape photography that I hope will be helpful for you. And we'll take a look at some work by photographers that I've drawn on for inspiration over the years. Let's begin with the importance of finding a point of interest that will catch your viewer's attention. Having one will make your intent easy to grasp. A strong point of interest gives your image instant interest and impact. This is an example of Lembert Dome in Yosemite that I long ago selected as a point of interest for my photography. After many trips and tries, I never felt I'd done this magnificent monolith justice in any of my photographs. So the lesson I learned is that once you've found your subject, slow down and think about composing around it. Often there can be a better compositional point of view given the time and effort to find it, such as this location that I found on the Merced River about a half a mile away from Lembert Dome. Think lines. They are generally an important component of every landscape composition. They can be horizontal, vertical, parallel, curved, diagonal, converging, or a combination. They naturally help the viewer's eye move from or into one part of an image to another or to a specific point of interest. Leading lines, such as a road, river, or object, are often used to draw the viewer's eye to the intended subject or point of interest. In this image, the foreground rocks act as a leading line to the heart of the evening sunset. Not all lines, however, are necessarily leading. Typical horizontal lines are commonly horizons, but might also be fallen trees, roof lines, or other objects. Horizontal subject matter has something that speaks of permanency or rest. They can often act as dividing points in a photograph or become an anchor that the rest of the image sits on or is formed around. Or it can support movement such as a runner or a vehicle. To the contrary, vertical lines are strong, dignified, and rigid. They can represent height or even infinity, especially if you can't see the top of them. For this reason, verticals are sometimes associated with religion. Verticals are seldom, if ever, used to represent movement or rest like a horizontal line does. The use of a curved line can gently help set the scene and guide a viewer's eyes through the frame, such as Big Bend Falls here in Leavining Creek does, leading us to the small patch of fall color in the background. Diagonal lines are dynamic, and they draw the viewer's eye through the photograph. Diagonals can give the image depth and suggested perspective. Where they intersect, they can emphasize or frame points of interest. As I've illustrated here, there's a diagonal line leading across the foreground trees that intersects with a line coming off of the slope on the left, which intersects with a slope on the right, which forms more diagonal lines that triangulate and bring the eye to my point of interest, which is the distant peak in McGee Creek. Converging lines can also help you emphasize depth and guide your viewer's eye through an image, such as in this scene from Scary Dairy in Camarillo. Repetition can give your images rhythm, similar to what it does for a song. It helps the eye dance from point to point. And again, similar to music, the viewer is not expected to listen to a single note, but take in the variety of high notes, low notes, movements, and beat as a whole, as in this image at Morro Bay. Humans are drawn to visual perfection and compositions that work in harmony. Thus, symmetrical images stand out because they're attractive to the eye. Symmetry can be horizontal, as shown in this image, or vertical or radial. It doesn't have to be perfect, particularly in landscape photography. This image of the American Cemetery in Florence is a great example of horizontal symmetry. And this scene from downtown LA is an example of vertical symmetry. Finally, this topiary hedge at the Getty Museum is an example of radial symmetry. You can find layers almost everywhere in landscapes, and there are usually at least two, the earth and the sky. Here's an example of how you can use layers to draw the eye into an image and create an impression of depth. So oftentimes we talk about having a strong foreground, middle ground, and background as a means of drawing the eye into the image. In this case, we actually have 5 layers drawing the eye in, from the foreground flowers to the tree, to the middle ground of the lower mountains, to the background of the higher mountains, and to the sky. Form, pattern, texture. Look for the use of patterns, shapes, and textures in your landscapes. The human eye seeks them out, and they are found everywhere, such as in the Guadalupe Dunes near Santa Maria featured in this image. Whether random or ordered, patterns can be very pleasing to the eye, and alone they can serve as your main subject and focal point, as illustrated in this image from a large wall in Sedona's West Fork Canyon. Form is a three-dimensional version of a shape and can give your images the appearance of depth, despite the fact that they're still part of a two-dimensional image. Framing. Look for opportunities to frame your subject or point of interest. Think about how a picture frame accentuates a photo or a painting. It directs the viewer's eye to where you want them to go. The main prerequisite is that it supports the subject, not distract from it. You can use natural geologic formations to frame a point of interest, such as Mobius Arch here in the Alabama hills, or trees, which commonly act as frames and are usually all around us. Imbalance is uncomfortable and can instantly turn off a viewer. Balance provides visual weight in an image that can be formal or informal. Formal balance is almost always symmetrical and easy to identify, as it is in this photo of the Ponte Vecchia in Florence, Italy. Simply put, informal balance occurs when dissimilar images balance each other out. The physical size of each element is irrelevant. Again, it's the visual weight that counts. Informal balance can often give your images variety, interest, and liveliness. In this example, the cross forms a balance with the Santa Barbara Mission. One without the other would create a highly imbalanced image. I love showing this image and telling the story of Fred Koretsky, who is a judge that often came to our local clubs. And Fred taught photography at Valley College, and everything was always about balance. And I entered this image not knowing that he was the judge for the night and was afraid that he was going to skewer me, but instead he gave me a very high score. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, Fred, what's with your giving me the high score on this image? And he said, keep in mind that it's visual balance that counts, not the physical weight. He said, the seagulls flying through the negative space are so powerful that they offset the boats on the left-hand side. It's a lesson that I took with myself and have thought about often when I balance images. Size is a relationship between elements in your composition and can provide a sense of scale. Often the most important object is the largest. In this case, how to show the immensity of the clouds over Lahaina near sunset. It was an amazing evening. I tried to frame the boat into the image so that I would have something as a point of reference to show the scale of those mountains. Although you can see very, very slightly the tiny town of Lahaina in the back, which also provides a sense of size and scale with the clouds. Would someone viewing this image of the Disney Concert Hall who had never previously seen it be able to visualize its actual immense size? Would they be able to tell whether it was 20 feet high, 50 feet high, 100 feet high, or exactly how immense the image is? Well, in the original image, before I took them out, there are two visitors standing on the balcony, which really give this image scale and illustrate its magnificence. Simplify. You'll often have greater impact and be able to convey the specific story by simplification. Sometimes it's better to simply focus on a smaller section of an image that can be more impactful. In this case, Tuolumne Falls in Bend, Oregon, the first version certainly was not bad, but I think this one best illustrates what I saw and felt of the thunder and the roar of the immense amount of water falling on the rocks. In this case, we're going to give an illustration of simplification. We have a typical broad landscaped image from a morning at Zabriskie Point in Death Valley. And of course, you've got the big immense sky, you've got the airplane trail in the upper right corner, distracting from the overall image. Simple elimination of the distracting jet trail and excessive negative space lets the viewer's eye better focus on the subject. As in the waterfall example, there can also be oftentimes several other good compositions within the larger scene, which I've actually done on this image by separating out and cropping into the nice area in the lower right with a leading line going in, and some of the areas on the left of the Badlands with their great texture, lines, and form. Try minimalism. It's the ultimate simplification. Motion. Movement can help you create mood, emotion, and impact in your images. It can be very subtle or it can be bold. Think of grasses, clouds, sand, etc. that we often pass by because of the wind and motion. Here's an example of cloud movement over Lake Crowley at dawn, or the Deschutes River in Bend, Oregon, that I narrowed down to simplify due to the messy background that there was behind it. But I love the golden look in the water and the movement, and so I framed it tight with a slow shutter, and I think it's effective. Think camera movement. You can illustrate movement with the use of camera panning or with special lenses such as the Lens Baby, or nowadays simulate it in post-processing, as I did in this case. And think about focusing on implied motion. In this case, the Pepperdine 9/11 flags, which I think most of us have photographed so often, and we tend to focus on the big, broad landscape rather than the detail. What I was really trying to capture here was the wind, the flapping that you hear of the flags, the drama, by cropping down and focusing on a small section of the larger image. Light can be your best friend or sometimes perceived as the enemy, and it's always one of the most important elements in any form of art. In this case, it was certainly my friend that evening at the Carlsbad Pier. Side lighting can reveal texture and structure, such as this image of the Mesquite Dunes in Death Valley. And rise and shine, the best landscape light usually occurs during the first couple of hours in the day, or stay for the last couple of hours late in the afternoon. The blue hour, just before sunrise, and the golden hour, or after sunset, is often dismissed by a lot of photographers. But it's a time when you often can capture soft colors and beautiful, subtle tones, as illustrated here at Mono Lake. Finding a backlit subject can create drama in your image. Be sure and bracket to find proper exposure and possibly for the opportunity to do some HDR, as you tend to get extremes from the light and dark in a backlit scene. This is the Sacramento Wildlife Refuge up in Central California. Mood. Mood in your images can stir emotion. Red hot, cold blue, foggy, etc. Sitting on the shoreline, I just wanted to pause and sit a while, and I still want to do so when viewing this image at Morro Bay. And when light isn't optimal, think mono. In this case, this tree stump, or actually a tree in Yosemite, in the upper area of Yosemite, where it was absolutely midday, and while the color image really wasn't bad, converting it to mono really helped bring out the drama of the shape, texture, lines in both the tree and the foreground rocks and background sky. Rule of odds. Your images are more visually appealing when there are an odd number of subjects rather than even. Our brains are wired to compare and go back and forth between competing even numbers of objects. An odd number tends to let the eye flow around the image more easily, and it can lead to a greater feeling of harmony within the image, as I think is illustrated here with the three pillars in the back and of course the one fountain in the foreground. And I might bring to your attention one thing I've never liked about this image is what we call the tangency between the left side of the fountain and the pillar. I really wish I had stepped back another foot or two and framed it a little bit differently so that it had a little bit of separation from that pillar and the eye could more comfortably go around the fountain. Oh, the old rule of thirds. This is a nicely processed image, but it's squared up. I find it uncomfortable and it lacks balance. There's a nice leading line, and I personally like the rule I broke by having her back turned to me. Perhaps that's a result of watching her fade off into the fog. With the rule of thirds applied, it can change the entire image. It's so often referenced that folks often get weary of hearing about it and think it shouldn't be broken. But more often than not, when the rule of thirds has been broken, it's simply been replaced by another use of a different rule. It's a tried and true rudimentary method that can be traced back to the Renaissance art and beyond. And it's simple, almost foolproof. It's a formula you can use to create dynamic balance in image. It simply divides the image into horizontal and vertical thirds with a point of interest placed at the intersection of one of those horizontal and vertical points. But it certainly does not have to be exact, and it's not meant to be used in every situation. When applied to this image, balance has been well restored, and the overall image becomes much more interesting. So here it is without the lines, and I think you'll find it's much more comfortable and balanced than it was before. Note that oftentimes there can be balance created by light against dark, which partially is the case here, although I think the real balance occurs with the woman in the trail and the gull up in the upper left. A few quick hints and tips. Digital film is free, so feel free to take lots of shots. Wait for the moment and continue shooting through changing light. An image taken after the sunset at where Mono Lake went almost completely pitch black is shown in this scene. Photographers left on a hike back to the parking lot after the sun went down, only to turn around and see a fairly common phenomenon known as the bounce. So keep shooting and start shooting when the light starts changing and finish shooting when it's done, and you'll oftentimes find the optimal image within that collection. Get high, get low, try different angles, roam around. In this image, I finally got down low and I think provided some perspective that helps show the grandeur of the redwoods up in Northern California. Turn around. All of us were at Zabriskie Point in Death Valley, waiting for the sun to hit the hills to the west, and it was dark and there was really nothing to shoot, and I turned around and was struck by the light in the early morning to the east. Now, this may not have been the best keeper of that day, but what it did by me turning around was it prepared me for what was about to come at the other end, and let me get some good shots that morning. Iconic location, find a different point of view. So often I look at images of Bridal Veil and Yosemite, and that location has been taken thousands of times, likely by much better photographers than myself, and my chance of ever being there on the right day and the right time are probably nil. Although I would love to get back there and try occasionally, I generally spend more time up in the upper area of Yosemite where I can find different points of view. This particular image is one of the most famous in Arizona. You'll find it on the cover of magazines and promotional materials. It's everywhere, but rarely is it seen from this point of view. So I've shot Cathedral Rock, which is what it is, many, many times, but oftentimes, or more often than not, it's been untimely, and I haven't gotten anything that I felt was that great. Then this time, during the fall, I had been down below shooting it from the traditional location from east to west, and couldn't find anything that was really good. So I was leaving. I saw a dirt road that led off the different direction and decided to explore. And this is what I found on a road that leads to the Rangers headquarters that they stay at during the summer to service the local national parks. So this is an image of Cathedral Rock taken from north to south rather than the traditional west to east. And I've often had photographers comment on how unique and special it is. And fortunately, I've managed to earn a Best of Show and several awards with this image. And a lot of photographers that know Sedona still don't necessarily recognize it right away. I'm often asked about depth of field, and in landscape photography, generally, what you want is depth of field from the near foreground all the way to the background. And I've had times where on field trips, I've had long conversations and questions from photographers asking how I determine how to shoot various areas. And some of it is just experience, look and feel. If you want to learn all about depth of field, you can study the circle of confusion or use depth of field calculators, or in this case where I want maximum depth of field and I don't have a depth of field calculator readily available or it's inconvenient, I more simply focus 1/3 into the scene. You can see the red dot representing the focus point of this image. So 1/3 into the image, use an aperture of somewhere between f8 and I would say f16. Be careful not to step down too far, down to f22 or further, or you may set in motion something called diffraction, where as the aperture gets so small, it actually scatters, squeezes and scatters the light and will not give you the best image. This technique isn't always perfect, but it's an easy way to get better sharp landscapes without going through the great effort of a actual depth of field calculator. A lot of photographers will typically have their focus point up somewhere in the middle of the image rather than in the lower third. Contrarily, if you want to use or isolate a specific point of interest, use shallow depth of field. And basically what you're doing is you're opening up your aperture, using a longer focal length, and putting your focus point directly on the subject of interest. Use a tripod. I'm guilty of not using one and depending on image stabilization, and IS or VR is great. The freedom of shooting handheld, though, often results in just random, poorly composed images that most often are not as sharp as they might otherwise be. More than anything else, using a tripod will slow you down, it will help you identify your point of interest, and more than anything else, it will help you compose. Tips on some filters. I personally don't believe in putting clear filters or UV filters in front of a piece of glass that I've paid a lot of money for. Even the better filters can still provide some glare or cause some glare or some ghosting, and I just don't see the need for them. In over 60 years of shooting, I've never damaged the front element of a lens. I have damaged a number of lenses, but never the front element. Generally, it's been shock damage to the internals or some other reason. Get insurance, it's not expensive, and use a hood, which will also give you better contrast on your images. My number one carry around filter is a polarizer. I use it to reduce glare and reflections primarily. Very, very rarely use it for saturation. It can cause uneven color. And I'll also occasionally carry around a neutral density filter when I know that I'm going to want to slow shutter speeds to provide motion in water or otherwise. And I have two different types. One are variable, which are becoming much more popular, where you can change the density by rotating the filter, versus some others that are the old regular fixed kind, where you have to have a different filter for each density. Both I find I use. The variable is convenient. The fixed densities I often use in conjunction with a polarizer stacked on top of it to get rid of glare on the surface of water, especially in slow shutter situations. Graduated neutral density filters I used to always carry, have a whole slew of them, two pouches of them. Now I do mostly in post-processing for a variety of reasons, more so than we have time for tonight. The polarizer, I'd like to give a little demonstration and illustration of what I'm talking about. This is my car. The back windshield or the back glass is reflecting the clouds. It has a glare over it, and when I put a polarizer on, this is what happens. That glare goes away. So very effective when you're shooting architecture with windows and what have you, or it's very effective in shooting water, such as this scene in McGee Creek, where without the polarizer, the rocks that you could see in the foreground under the water were basically invisible from the glare. And the area behind the log, the glare was so bad that virtually there was no texture or any sense of what was there. With the polarizer, it fixed all of that, and it was stacked on top of a neutral density filter. Here's an example of where a polarizer can cause uneven exposure because a polarizer changes the amount of polarization as you move from 45-degree angle from the sun to 180 degrees where there is virtually no polarized effect whatsoever. A lot of folks ask me when to use horizontal versus vertical orientation in your images. So, a landscape can be shot in portrait, and a portrait can be shot in landscape. Wait a minute, have I gone cross-eyed? When to use each? There is not a hard or fast rule. Horizontal orientation suggests a sense of largeness in landscapes, which most are. Horizontal images are best used when the subject is horizontal. When your subject is wider than it is tall, a horizontal image complements the subject. When your subject is moving, you have a moving subject such as a automobile, a runner, a horse, from one side to the other of the frame. Horizontal leaves space for that subject to move into. Vertical landscapes, our vertical landscape photos work best when the subject is also vertical. Consider a very tall waterfall or mountain peak. This is Coffee Pot in Sedona, and it is indeed very vertical itself, and it's also surrounded by a lot of distractions and messiness on each side. So a vertical certainly works best in this situation. Tip of common problems very, very quickly that casual viewers may be uncomfortable with, but unable to quite grasp why. And they're often red flags for experienced judges when you enter competitions. First and foremost are distracting light leaks and or dark spots that generally you can fairly easily get rid of. Also unnecessary elements that distract the eye from the message that you're trying to portray or your point of interest. Inappropriate distortion or keystoning, tilted horizon, which I see so often, and with my images, even when I think they're straight, I often use the tool in Photoshop, Lightroom, or Camera Raw to make sure that visually it's correct. Heavy or distracting key lines or borders. Used to be popular to put white lines, white key lines, or to use white mats or borders around images. That was often the case when you were displaying fine art, and still is in museums and what have you. But generally, the feeling now is that lighter key lines or lighter borders tend to distract and take the eye out of the image rather than focusing it into the image as you would want them to. Tangency between the edges of objects or the side of an image can be very disturbing and distracting, and often not obvious to the casual viewer. For inspiration, here are some of my favorite landscape photographers. The first you're going to probably find unusual because he's not really known primarily as a landscape photographer. In fact, some folks are surprised that he has even done landscapes, and that is J. Maisel. He's high on my list, period, of great photographers that I like to follow and study. His use of texture, form, light is absolutely amazing, and I look at even some of his street photography that I could almost overlay and use examples of how to create power and imagery in a landscape. Galen Rowell is another who I really respect, who's a man that went into the mountains, the desert, to the edge of the sea. He hung from ropes on high cliffs with danger, just simply to get a different point of view on common subjects, to find something different to show and interesting and more impactful. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, or I should say a few years ago, and recently his iconic Mountain Light Gallery in Bishop, California closed, but you can still view a lot of his work on the internet. G. Dan Mitchell is one of my favorites. He wrote a book called California Fall Color, A Photographer's Guide to Autumn in the Sierra, and he manages to find subtle ways of attracting the eye and getting you there without necessarily a lot of drama, which I really like. Most of his images have soft tones and almost lean to the point of being a little overexposed, but always seem to work. He has a blog that I follow on the internet, and also a Facebook page which is very popular with landscape photographers. I think you have to be approved to get in, and he has pretty strict rules on what you're allowed to show, but it's very worthwhile, I think, to give you ideas. Art Wolfe, I never really thought a whole lot about until I took a workshop from him a few years ago where he talked about photography as art, and admitted that for years he really just went to great iconic places and prayed and sprayed, taking thousands of images, which he then turned over to his staff to figure out. He has certainly got a multifaceted career, teaching in journalism, writing journalistically, and involving wildlife and certainly landscapes. And since taking his seminar, it had a great impact on me, and I have been following him more closely. Andreas Gursky probably stirs the greatest emotion and debate in photography when his name comes up among my friends. And I say that his work is a little bit like the need for acquiring a taste for fine wine. This image is a picture of the Rhine, which is the highest selling photograph in history. It's called Rhine Foo, sold for $4,338,500. That price has been superseded by another photographer who is suspect of a maybe not a truly real sale. But Andreas Gursky, I think if you take some time to look through and study the principles and elements of art and look at his image, or images I should say, you'll find that he subtly uses them to great effect. Takeshi Mitsukoshi is an interesting Japanese fella born in 1938, actually studied forestry and agriculture in college and dropped out to pursue a passion for photography. You won't find a website of his, never has had one. You'll have to find him. You can Google his name and you'll find a number of galleries and what have you that show his work. He has been considered up there with the greatest landscape photographers such as Ansel Adams, Michael Kenna, and others. Alex Noriega is fascinating to me because after less than 8 years as a photographer, he won 3 major international awards and had been published in most every magazine, online website that I have ever seen. Absolutely amazing, incredible photography. Check out Alex Noriega. Be remiss if I didn't mention Christopher Broughton, who, as such a good friend of our club, has really had an impact on me in the last couple of years. And in looking at his work, often feel like I've been missing something and that I should pay more attention to Christopher. His work is so subtle and poignant, and the point of interest is always there, surrounded by, in this case, in this image, it's so simple, but there's so much drama. I love looking at especially his prints. He is a master at printing monochrome. And again, love Christopher Broughton. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Ansel Adams, who of course is almost the dean of landscape photography. Finally, I'll put up this little list here for you quickly if you need to look at spelling or want to jot down a name, or if you miss it, feel free to email me and I'll provide you with the list otherwise. So, a couple things for research. Just Google landscape composition, the term, or any of the specific elements that I've mentioned here, and you will find a goldmine of tutorials and information to go into much greater depth than I've had the time to do tonight. Also, Google Getty Formal Analysis, which will take you to the Getty Museum's little educational program on the principles and elements of art and design that have had a great deal of impact on my thinking regarding composition over the last 4 or 5 years. For those of you that want to go into a little greater journey on composition, dynamic symmetry is something that has become more popular in the last few years. I've struggled a little bit with adopting it myself, but it's interesting and I think works very, very well. in most situations. Finally, for those of you that question all of these rules and all of these elements and what have you, I'd like to suggest a book. And that is one by Harvard neurobiologist Margaret Livingstone, who explores the subject in her Vision and Art Biology of Seeing. In it, she demonstrates how we see art and how it ultimately depends on the cells in our eyes and brains. She goes into great depth in showing how great painters and artists have fooled the brain, and why Mona Lisa's smile seems so mysterious and Monet's poppy field appears to sway in the breeze. It's really interesting reading. I know my friend Roy Patience has tried to get into it. If you're not a scientist or neurobiologist, you may find the first couple chapters a little difficult getting through. Just skip them and move on. I picked up my copy for very little on eBay and suspect that you could probably do likewise. With that, that's all, folks. Question or comments, email me at hutch@digitaldaydreaming.com, and thank you very much for attending this session.